Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS variables, or custom properties as they are more formally known. And CSS variables are simply a way for us to give names to values in CSS. That way we can remove the redundancy of having the same values throughout our CSS files, and just have them in one place and reuse the names throughout. So to look at this example here, first we have a header with the h1 of CSS variables. Then we have a main tag. Inside of the main tag, we have two sections, each with an h2, so section 1 and section 2. And then if we come over to our CSS, you can see we have the h1 rule set where we give it a text color of this hex value here. And then we have an h2 rule set where we give it some padding and the font color of white. And then we have the main tag, which we set to be display of flex. We give it a 5 pixel solid black border, 12 pixels of gap between the flex items, which will be the two sections, then a width of 412 pixels. And finally, we have the sections, which have a flex basis of 200 pixels, which remember will essentially act like a width in this case. Then we have a flex shrink and grow of 0, saying we do not want these sections to grow or shrink, we want them to stay at 200 pixels. Then we set a background color to the same value that we used for the color of the h1. So if we look at the output, you can see the two sections have the same background color, that dark blue color, as the CSS variable's text has for a font color. So then the question is, what issues do we see with this CSS file? Well, there's a few of them. For one, we have this color in two places, and that's not the best thing to be doing. You could imagine if we had a huge CSS file for a massive website, and we had some main color that was the main website color. We don't want that to be all over the CSS file, because what if we want to change it? It will be a bit of a pain to change it, especially if it is all over a bunch of different CSS files. So what we can do instead is we're going to want to have a variable to give a name to this color. That way we only have to use the color one time. And then we also have this width of 412 pixels, which is a very exact value, and it's not very clear what this is. Well, what it actually is it's the flex basis of each section, so the width of the two sections, multiplied by 2, and then added the gap in there as well. So we need a way to calculate that, because what would happen if this flex basis were to change? Maybe these are changed to 100 pixels. Now the main is too big for its content. And as a bit of a disclaimer, there are other ways we could have created this layout and avoided this issue, but for the purpose of demonstration, let's see how we can keep this 200 pixels hard-coded flex basis as well as this width and still have everything working. So first, let's create a CSS variable. And the way we usually do this is on the root pseudoclass. So we can say root, and then we will define our variables here. The reason we do this is because we want our variables to be accessible in the entire document, and the root pseudoclass does just that. You can also use the HTML tag here. It will do the same thing. We can also make our variables specific to portions of the DOM if we wanted, but that tends to be a little bit less common. The most common thing you'll see is this root pseudoclass. So to define a variable, we give it 2 dashes at the start of its name and then just the name. So I'll call this one main color, and then we can just put in whatever value we want. For example, this value here, we can copy it and add a semicolon, and that will create a main color variable. Next, to use the variable, we can copy the name, and then we will just replace this value with a call to the var function, and then the name inside, including the 2 dashes. You'll see nothing will change. This works exactly as before. We can copy this down here to this background color here, and we will get the exact same output once again. But what's cool now is if we ever need to change this, we can change the main color to say red, and now all of the values using that main color will shift with it. We won't have to change it in multiple different places. But for now, I will go back to this color we had. It's a little bit easier to look at. And next, let's try to solve the issue of this width. So we probably don't want a 412 pixel exact width. That's a little bit strange. We want to be calculating this value. So first, let's remove some of the hard-coded values that are making up the width. So first, we had that flex basis of 200 pixels. So let's call this section size, and we will make this 200 pixels. Then we can copy this name, and we can paste it into the flex basis. We will call variable section size. And the other component to this width was the gap. So we can call this maybe flex gap. 12 pixels. And then instead of this 12 pixel value here, we'll say var flex gap, add a semicolon. And again, nothing will change because we are just adding names to these values. We haven't actually changed any values. And now the width, we need to actually calculate this. And what we can use is this calc function. And the calc function allows you to add up values, and it's really cool because you can even add up values of different units. So for example, I could say 100 pixels plus 20 VW, and this would calculate that width for me. But that's not what we want here. What we want here is to actually use these values or the variables that we have saved. So we can say the variable for the section size, and we want to multiply that by 2. And that will give us a good start, but you'll see it's not quite large enough. And the reason for that is because we need to also add in the space for that flex gap. So we can just add the variable of flex gap here. And now you'll see we get exactly what we want because this width is now being calculated as the section size multiplied by 2 because we have 2 sections. And we could even go a step further if we wanted and try to factor that number 2 out as well. But for now, I will leave it there. And then we are adding in the gap between the elements. And now one last thing I wanted to demonstrate is that this root pseudoclass, if we were to change it to say main, for example, this would now only affect things nested inside of the main tag. So the header is no longer affected. And if I make this color red again, so it's easier to see, you can see the font color of the header is not changing because this is only affecting things that are inside of the main tag. But again, I will go back to root. And the last point I did want to make is that this is something that comes with CSS by default, but you might also see CSS variables through the form of Sass or less or one of the other preprocessors, and that is perfectly fine, and there are use cases for that as well as for these, but this is the one that comes with CSS by default, so I wanted to show this in the video here. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.